Hello, everyone, and let's put my face over here by Queen Elizabeth. There we go. Okay, hello, everyone, and welcome to the second week of our course. So, this week we're getting into the assigned textbook. Hopefully, you have all been able to get access to the book last week. A few of you emailed me about it. If you are still having trouble getting access to the book, this is what it looks like. Jill Lepore, These Truths, A History of the United States. So if you still don't have access to this book, let me know, and I can see if I can help you out. I don't know if our bookstore has it available yet. Some of you told me that it was having difficulties having it in stock. So hopefully it's available there. If it's not, you can get it through any online retailer. I mean, just Google the title and you can find it. It's typically around $20 new. It's also available through lots of public libraries. If you happen to be a resident of anywhere in New York State, you have access to the ebook version of it through the New York City Public Library. You have to get a New York City Public Library card, which anyone who's a resident of the entire state can do. And then you use some kind of goofy app that they have to be able to read it. I've had a student in the past tell me that the app is kind of hard to use. Um, Hopefully it was just that student. I don't personally know. I haven't used the app before. But let me know if you haven't been able to get access to it. And I also want to be clear, there are different versions of this book. There's a version from 2019, there's a version from 2018. They're both fine. You can get an audiobook, you can get an ebook. It's all the same. Some of the audiobooks and ebooks don't necessarily tell you what page numbers things are on, which is why I've tried to reformat the focus questions to just be chapter specific. So, yeah, let me know if you haven't been able to get access to the book, but you do need access to it for this week's focus questions. So, okay, you're in the second week of the class now, so I should go over a few expectations too. So, ideally, you all made a post to the discussion board last week. I'm actually recording this on Saturday, so I haven't looked at the discussion board yet. I typically start looking at it on Monday after everyone's had a chance to really respond to each other. Uh, so I want everybody to make one discussion board post per week and then comment on two of your classmates' posts. So I will also be sending you back your focus questions over the next few days. Uh, by Friday of this week, you should all have a grade for me for your first week set of focus questions and your first week set of discussion board posts. If for some reason you don't have that grade by then, feel free to email me and be like, "Hey, what's going on?" And I'll probably say, I got behind for whatever reason." Okay, so I'm going to be lenient as well for the first few weeks, and I just want to make sure that you can get your work in. So if for any reason you didn't get the work done last week, go ahead and do it. I will take it late. I want you to be able to be successful in this class. And if you're having trouble with anything, just remember that I Zoom every Monday through Friday from 9 to 10 a.m. And you can email me absolutely whenever you want. So okay, let's jump right into Lepore now. Absolutely love this book. Again, it is one of the best comprehensive books on American history that I've read in a very long time. So Lepore writes a wonderful political history of the U.S. from above in a way that engages with voices from below. So I'm going to explain myself a little bit. In the 1960s, U.S. historians began a trend of wanting to deconstruct American histories that essentially focused on the exploits of rich, powerful white men. And this wasn't just happening in the United States. This was part of a global trend seeking to complicate what historians were calling histories from above. They wanted to instead focus their attention on what, after James Scott, were called subaltern people, those people who had been forgotten by other historians. So they looked at racial, religious, sexual minorities, or what they called histories from below. And these historians, they also gave new strength to women's studies as well, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. And it's ongoing today. It's not like this has stopped. So over the decades since then, somewhat of a rift has developed between political historians who still tried to historicize those in power and everyone else who wanted to look at the forgotten stories of the people without power. So when I was growing up, my K through 12 American history textbooks, this is in the 1980s and 1990s, would typically contain a history of wars and politics featuring powerful white men with little sidebars talking about people like maybe Harriet Tubman or Eugene Debs. Though those people were in the book, but they were not the main story of the book. So as I look over my own kids' ELA work, what does ELA stand for? English Language Arts. They're I have a fourth grader and a kindergartner. I I'm impressed with how things have changed. So the amount of people who are considered part of the main story has certainly increased, and that's a really good thing. And I think that that's the fruit of historians who, for decades, have researched histories from below in efforts to rewrite main narratives in a way that is inclusive of oppressed voices. So many of these historians inevitably came to the conclusion that blind celebrations of American values and greatness were somewhat hollow. They thus have been accused, these historians from below, writing since the 1960s, of being unpatriotic, and they've certainly spurned a generally conservative historical establishment that seeks to sort of recanonize and re-romanticize the saints and heroes of American history. So what I love so much about Lepore is that she transcends this bifurcation. It doesn't need to be either or. Lepore is a political historian who celebrates American values. She looks at the powerful white men of history. It's not as if she ignores them. The title of her book, These Truths, refers to those noble sentiments of classical liberalism, too, that appear in our Declaration of Independence, ideas that have inspired virtually every constitution in the world today, including our own, which came a decade after the Declaration of Independence. She celebrates American values while at the same time looking squarely in the face of what she calls America's original sin of slavery. Throughout the book, slavery, racism, the horrors inflicted on Native people, and the horrors inflicted on minority groups, and wars of imperialism are not sidebars. They're part of the main narrative. To be fair, she's not the only writer who's ever done this. She just happens to be, in my opinion, the best. And she did it in a book that's only $20, brand new. I think it's up to $24 now. Unlike other prominent American historians who like to charge students over $100 for textbooks. So, in this week's discussion board, I want to see your thoughts on Lepore as well, especially the title, These Truths. So, all right, let's skip slides now. All right, so I'll put myself right by the beggars. How about right there? Okay. So one of the things that can be difficult with Lepore is that she jumps around a lot. She follows and develops ideas without necessarily fully explaining the context of those ideas. That's fine and well as long as we all do the work together of making sure we understand the context so that we can follow her arguments. So you probably noticed that there's a lot of overlap between the first chapter of Lepore and your chapter from the Man reading last week. Man, however, focuses more on native peoples, while Lepore focuses more on the settlers, specifically Spanish, a little bit of French, and primarily English settlers. So in this first chapter of Lepore, you see that for so many in Europe, the very idea of the New World, America, as it quickly became known, enlivened people's imaginations. Massive Spanish wealth also whetted the appetites of other Atlantic-facing powers like the Dutch, who in the 16th century were in rebellion against New Spain. Part of what made their rebellion successful was an ability to prey on Spanish treasure fleets with a form of pirates who they originally called sea beggars. So the Dutch, as I mentioned earlier, would eventually take part in the colonization of the New World, along with much of the global South as well. And uh, many of us live in what was once New Amsterdam as well. So, oop, here we go. Okay, so with this Venn diagram here, I want to give you an early overview of English settlement in North America by roughly distinguishing types of colonization, as I do with this goofy diagram. So, on the one hand, you have those extraction-based colonies, largely in places like the Caribbean, Brazil, though parts of North America too. Spanish and Portuguese colonists early on were far more interested in resources than land for people to settle. English settlers were quite the opposite in North America, with many, of course, who also came for riches to go home and buy a mansion. This was certainly true of English people in the Caribbean. So many English settlers, however, came to build new homes and to settle a new land. They came to stay. So this chapter and the next have a nice discussion of how that impacted ideas of race, too. The Spanish didn't initially feel as threatened by differences in skin color, and instead classified differences in people's physical appearance in a diverse number of ways meant to satisfy their curiosity more than anything else. English settlers, however, very quickly developed race as a concept to justify slavery and secure white privileges as they set up a caste system to control a slave-based society. We'll go into this a bit more in depth in following weeks, but on this diagram, I've tried to split, the two ideal types, English versus Spanish and Portuguese, with those people who are sort of in the middle. And these were people who often settled, while other groups from their same home country just wanted wealth to return home. So I've included like the Dutch, French, and Swedish settlement, especially what was important in Delaware. So let me switch. I want to, oops. Okay, I want to spend a good amount of time this week contextualizing the history of slavery as well, in a way that I hope will help you maintain a sense of disbelief. So these next few slides will be ones that I want to refer back to really throughout the semester. So we need to recognize just how horrible and abnormal slavery was. I frequently, less so this last year, because of I think the powerful moment that the George Floyd protests in particular caused for white people to, but I frequently have heard people dismiss slavery in the past in general by saying things like, well, that's just what people did back then, or I'll hear people say, Africans had slaves too. These are both true statements, but they're nonsensical whataboutisms that completely ignore human suffering by either assuming moral relativity or moral equivalency. So to the first statement that that's just what people did back then, quite simply, not everyone thought slavery was a good idea, especially not slaves or those who fought against slavery from the very beginning of slavery. As to the second statement, I mean, what did my mom used to say to me when I got in trouble and tried to say, well, Matt's doing it too? She would say, two wrongs don't make a right. If this was, of course, a course on another part of the world, I would emphasize other people's responsibility for human rights abuses. But since this is a course on early American history, we're going to be focusing on our own American responsibility to history, especially our responsibility to the history of slavery. So, slavery, let's now broadly just talk about it a bit. It is as old as human conflict. By the time of the classical period, meaning that of the Greek and Roman civilizations, slavery was widespread. In Rome, ever increasing slavery eroded the ethic of a republic made up of small, independent farmers and replaced it with large plantations, latifundia, worked by slaves captured in what would become the perpetual wars of the empire period. Basically, in Rome, slavery didn't just hurt the slaves, it undermined everyone's productivity and contributed to the downfall of Rome. During the Roman period and shortly thereafter, the two largest religious traditions in the world emerged. First, Christianity, then Islam, the two largest today. And each religion came about in a world where slavery was everywhere. And unfortunately, despite the goodness and beauty in each of these religious traditions, each had theologians who accommodated their beliefs to slavery. Thus, Christianity, which at its core was about loving one's neighbor, had thinkers like the Apostle Paul, who told slaves it was their duty to obey their masters. Islam, which has charity for the poor as one of its five pillars, also engaged with slavery, ultimately compromising that slaves should at least be treated well and ideally freed, but not necessarily freed. When slaves realized that conversion to Islam might be a ticket to freedom, slave traders came up with new excuses to keep their slaves, and essentially ignore that. So I'm just trying to give a back history of slavery to deal with this argument that, well, there was always slavery. And again, to help you maintain your sense of disbelief, to show that it was abnormal. Okay, so, oops. So, where Rome had been at the center of the Eastern Hemisphere's slave trading during antiquity, the center of slave trading remained in the Mediterranean and broader Middle East after Rome's fall. So, the Middle Eastern slave trade extended into East and West Africa, but more importantly, the vast hinterlands of Russia. So, our word for slave actually comes from the Russian word, or from the Roman word sklavus, which was a word for Slavs or slaves. So, Slavic people. That very word is our word for slave. So a prime commodity for governments along the peripheries of the Middle East, including West and Central Africa, the Caucasus, and Russia, was humans. And it was a horribly destabilizing and evil practice that moral thinkers along the peripheries and in the heart of the Middle East opposed from the very beginning. So, at the same time that slavery grew in the Mediterranean, it died out in other parts of Europe and China, largely because it was replaced with feudalism, an economic and social system where people have limited rights and are obligated to masters. In feudalism, the manor is the economic core of the system. A manor is an estate where peasants engage in things like agriculture, mining, or forestry for the benefit of the nobility. The nobility were a static class with rights given by the monarch who ruled with what, they like to call the divine right of kings. Feudalism had some similarities to slavery, but unlike slavery, it entailed actual responsibility towards the serfs. Feudalism was also, at least in Europe, incredibly unstable because no one ever knew whether the nobility, the monarch, or the church was in charge. So feudalism was a system kind of always in flux, with merchants, traders, and townspeople always undermining it. But I want to be clear that feudalism was preferable to the instability that came with the wars and slavery that preceded it. So the early modern period, a period typically stretching from Columbus's voyage to the French Revolution, is one where you see the development of early capitalism, or a system where ultimately capital, money, became more important than noble privilege. It's so, if you want to start a business, you don't have permission of the king, you just have to have money. Um, so it's in this period that mercantilism emerged as a system joining state and private initiative that was premised on controlling monopolies in the production of certain commodities. The capitalism, as imagined by Adam Smith, would later emphasize personal liberty, initiative, and free trade, and it was explicitly anti mercantilist as those structures undermined free trade. So in this period of proto capitalism, I mean, this is the period we're looking at right now with the settling of Jamestown, for instance, as people begin to think of new ways to make money. So, what is ironic is that slavery blossomed at the same time that ideas of free trade were developing. So, as far back as, well, and also especially in the period of mercantilism. So, as far back as the 1400s, Western Europeans began to flirt with the idea of slavery again. Slavery had all but died out in Europe at this time. The Portuguese were the first, along with many and prosperous Italian communes. So, as the Caribbean became the center of fabulous fortunes that could be made, especially in sugar, Spanish, Dutch, French, and English public opinion wrestled with the moral question of whether or not slavery was right or wrong. And I want to be clear, they wrestled with it. They did not just say, "Oh yeah, slavery, let's do it." Um, so it is ironic that most English people, the majority of English people, were initially adamantly against slavery, as it was an anti-Christian idea. They recognized it as such. But within only a generation, English plantations in North America and the Caribbean were major sources of slave importation, as were Portuguese, French, Dutch, Spanish, and even Danish plantations in South and Central America. So the slavery of the Atlantic world eventually surpassed the centuries long slavery of the Middle East, in part because the structures of exploitation and accompanying technologies that emerged in this period of proto-capitalism made it so. And as I've mentioned before, 12 to 15 million people were taken from their homes by force, with 10 to 20% of them dying before even reaching the New World. It also took an incredibly short period of time for people across the Americas to come up with black skin as an acceptable excuse for slavery. That got around the prohibition that some had against enslaving people who were also capable of converting to Christianity. So, this policy is really the beginning of racism. Racism isn't something that's always been around, it is grounded in the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade. Racism, anti black racism in particular, is about 400 years old, which means if it has a beginning, it can also have an end. So, to get back to the moral equivalency I mentioned at the beginning of class, slavery in the New World was ultimately worse in scope and scale than it was in the Old World, which by no means excuses the many people who engaged in slavery before the emergence of the Atlantic world. So, I also want to emphasize with this slide here that there was never, ever a consensus anywhere in the world that slavery was okay. There were heroes fighting against it anywhere and everywhere it's ever been. They're the reason that slavery is not legal anywhere in the world today. That's not to say it doesn't still exist, and certainly we can all draw inspiration from the heroes of the past. Many Christians refuse to blindly follow supposed Christian justifications for slavery. Muslims, too, as I mentioned earlier, also refuse to follow such justifications. The Christianity of these nonconformists, though, would become important to the settling of the early United States. Um, and they were all about actually following the anti establishment revolutionary ideas of Jesus Christ. Doing so made these people seem a bit crazy. Nonconformists who emerged in England in the 1600s were numerous by the 1700s. They included groups like Quakers, Methodists, evangelicals. They opposed the pursuit of profit for profit's sake and worried about the oppression of the poor, which they felt to be incompatible with their religious beliefs. One of these people, John Newton, was a former slave ship captain who converted to evangelical Christianity and wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, which is prominent among English speaking Christians all over the world today. It's been translated into many languages as well. So these people will come up later in class too. So, all right, that's a good amount of material. I want to show you these bonus questions now and give you a chance to do them. And again, this slideshow is available in simple slideshow format. This presentation is on YouTube, and the script that I presented from is also available on Vanco Hall if you want to just read through these notes. So, all right, good luck. Hopefully you're roaring and doing an amazing job in week 2, and reach out to me if for any reason you feel like you're not, or if you just want to talk about anything. I mean, my office hours are open time. Anyone can just click on the link on Vanco Hall and bam, you're in my Zoom session. Quite a few of you have done that already last week, and I enjoyed getting to meet you and getting to know you a little bit. All right, good luck. Have a good week.